culture in large, complex organizations has given her deep expertise in DEI practices and principles, especially in the area of communications. In fact, she broke barriers as one of the first, and for a long time only, Black C-level speechwriters in the Fortune 100. Her 3 TED presentations challenging businesses to get serious about inclusion have collectively over 2.5 million views. Her superpowers: applying neuroscience to solve DEI challenges, building actionable DEI frameworks, and brokering honest DEI conversations among top leaders. Please join me in welcoming NLI's Global Head of DEI, Janet M. Stovall. Great to have you here today, Janet.
Great to be here. Looking forward to this conversation.
Nice. And our moderator for today is a public speaker who engages on a variety of topics surrounding DEI, leadership, and women in the workplace. Not to mention her TEDx talk on banishing the miscongeniality complex. She's also the author of the book, Would the World Be Better If We Were All Alike? Her expertise in leadership development, diversity, strategic planning, and HR led her to join NLI, where she engages in client-facing consulting and facilitating teams to support organizational programs. A warm welcome to our distinguished faculty of leadership and performance at NLI, Christy Pruitt-Haynes. Welcome back, Christy. Happy to have you, and I will pass it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, and great to be here as always. So hello, everyone. Welcome to what I know is going to be a phenomenal conversation, partially because I just love doing these with Janet. She is absolutely one of my favorite people, and I think this is such an important and impactful topic. So Janet, before we even get started, would love to know, what are your overall kind of thoughts and disclaimers as we jump into this conversation, honestly, about a holiday and a day that a lot of people may not know that much about. So would love for you to sort of kick us off with kind of explaining what this is about and sharing any initial thoughts you have before we jump into some specific questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Christy. We know, most of us at this point know what Juneteenth is about. It was when the enslaved people in Galveston, Texas, found out 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation that they were free. And that's easy to find and look up. What we wanted to do was make this holiday relevant for a lot of people, because at the end of the day, we're going to talk today, this conversation is about Juneteenth. So we will focus on things that are unique to Juneteenth: Black people and racism. And we are aware that there's a whole multitude of issues and identities in DEI, but this is Juneteenth. And, you know, it is sort of an interesting line to walk when you do these things as an organization, because you don't want to be exploitative. And I worked really hard, Christy, to make sure that wasn't this. But we do believe that NLI has some unique expertise, and our job is to further the conversation. And so what we hope to do today is give you a way to look at Juneteenth, even if you thought Juneteenth wasn't for you. This is a way to look at it and maybe think about the fact that it is for you. So that's where we are, and I am looking forward to having this conversation with Christy.
Wonderful. And I completely agree, Janet. You know, our goal is to truly make this relevant to everybody, to more people, to more organizations, and to understand both the impact, what it's about, and how we can move forward with this. So as we think about it, we're going to go through 3 different lessons. You know, we love the number 3 here at NLI. So we will go through 3 lessons and have, I think, a truly engaging conversation about leadership lessons from Juneteenth that everybody can use. So this is for today's leaders. So we're going to make it relevant for each of us. And the first thing we want to talk a bit about is allyship, which is, again, I think a phrase, a question, or a concept that many people are familiar with, but we would love to look at it through the lens of Juneteenth and what this means. So Janet, I would love to hear from you. What does it mean to truly be an ally in today's workplace? And how does allyship work and connect with Juneteenth and dismantling systemic racism?
Okay, so Juneteenth, we know, was the end of some systemic racism, but not all. But in terms of laws, the systematic racism disappeared because the laws disappeared. But systematic racism and systematic inequity, its legacy is systemic racism and systemic inequity. That didn't go away. And it does show up in the workplace. And basically, it shows up at 3 levels. It shows up in individuals as biased, internalized, and explained to other people, and racial stereotypes, the individual part. It shows up interpersonally as microaggressions and behaviors of excluding people. You know, in LI, we always talk about in-group and out-group. That out-group mentality, pushing people to the other side, that's how systemic racism can show up. And it also shows up institutionally with biased policies and a bunch of inequitable practices. So the question is, what does it mean to be an ally in today's workplace? Well, first of all, I think we know today's workplace in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion is a little bit tricky. So it's a little bit more difficult now in some ways, I'm sure, but it's also more necessary. Because the thing is this, allyship is not kinship, it's not friendship. It is leveraging your privilege in the moment for somebody who has less privilege than you. And everybody hates the word privilege, but understand that it is simply something that you have that you were just born into. And it is something that you have in situations, because some people have it more than others, the dominant culture, but even Christy and I will have privilege in some situations. And so the point is knowing that you have it and leveraging it. So allyship is active. It's not something you have, it's something you do. And in the workplace, the way you deal with it on those three levels as an individual is you can examine your own biases and try to mitigate your own biases. Interpersonally, you can confront those microaggressions and those biases, and you can amplify marginalized voices. And then institutionally, you can advocate for equitable practices and policies. And we're going to talk about that a little bit further down the line. But at the end of the day, allyship is a journey of continuous learning and continuous work. You never stop being an ally. You also can't call yourself an ally. Somebody else has to call you that. And in this workplace right now, with the inequity we're dealing with, a lot of things that's seeming like it's going backwards, allyship is more important than ever. So Christy, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, first, I completely agree with everything that you said. And you know what's interesting is so often when people hear about allyship, they only think of it in terms, and as you pointed out, they think of it in terms of being someone's friend. And that is, you know, being friends at work, it's wonderful, but it's not necessary. And I think, you know, more specifically, when we think about being an ally, if we limit our thoughts to this is something I can do for my friends, then we miss out on the true opportunity there. One other thing I'd love to say, because I think a lot of people, and you said it as well, the word privilege is a charged word for so many people. It is a triggering word. And it shouldn't be, in my opinion, because again, privilege isn't about whether or not you are a good or bad person. Privilege simply is. And there are situations where each of us have it. And I like to think of privilege as the assumptions people make about you when you enter a situation. Are they automatically positive, or do they tend to be a bit more negative? And we can't control the way other people think of us. What we can do, though, is acknowledge that and then use those assumptions to benefit others. So as a quick example, and this is something that happened years ago, and I think it's a great example of how, you know, as Janet said, in different situations, everybody is going to have privilege. So I was going to a party. It was a family reunion, but it wasn't my family. So why I was even there, you know, is kind of a
because
whole
you're a
other
good
story.
Friend. You're a good friend. Okay.
Exactly. But as I was going there, and I had another friend with me, and you know, our friend who was actually a member of this family said, "Yes, y'all come, have a great time." Everybody who was in this family reunion looked like me. This was a Black family. So as I walk in, even though I wasn't a member of that family, even though I didn't know anyone there, I was instantly welcomed. It was assumed that I belonged there. So I walk in and they're, you know, telling me the food is over here and we're playing spades over there and all of those things. I had privilege in that moment. The friend I brought with me looks very different. She was a white woman, great friend of mine. But when she walked in, the way she was greeted was, "Wait, why are you here?" She was looked at as an outsider. And the truth is, both of us were outsiders. Neither of us technically belonged there. But I was given privilege in that situation because of my demographic traits. Absolutely. And the same thing happens, I think, so often in the workplace. Some people are just assumed to belong, so they are given that privilege. So what I did in this family reunion is I say, "Oh, I was invited by so-and-so." I mentioned the person who invited me, And this is my friend. She's with me. She's great people. You're going to love her. She actually is a better spades player than I will ever be. So I used that privilege to now bring her into the conversation, to help her be accepted in the same way that I automatically was. So again, in that moment, I was acting as her ally. And in most situations, you wouldn't look at me and say, this is somebody who has privilege, but I recognized that I did, and I used it, in that moment to bring her in and to extend it to her. And I think that is sort of what we, want to do. It's the way we want to think about it and the way we want to acknowledge me having privilege in that moment wasn't a good or bad thing. It simply was. What I chose to do with it, I think, is what's most important. And I think that's, yes, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. I interrupted you. I thought you were ending that. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think that's sort of the charge that we all have. So Janet, would love to hear your thoughts on that.
It's funny that you said that, because usually when I say that privilege is situational, if there are people of color, especially women of color, Black women in the audience, they're kind of looking at me sideways going, no, I don't believe that. And the example I use, I've done this in front of large groups. I'll say, everybody in the room stand up if you know who the Divine Nine are. Invariably, the Black people will stand up. And a few white people will stand up usually, but usually it's the only Black people in the room. And I'll say, the Divine Nine are the 9 historically Black sororities and fraternities. And they go, oh, I said, now, if you were in a meeting, those of you who are still sitting down, if you were in a meeting with any of those sororities or fraternities, what do you think you'd feel like? We would have privilege in that moment. And that usually people kind of sit and go, I said, we had privilege when they stood up. You automatically felt like there was a conversation that happened somewhere that you weren't part of. I said, so that's my point. I'm saying that to everybody, that when we say privilege, we're not saying that it's a bad thing. It's just a thing. It is. How you use it is what makes it good or bad. Because you can use it for good or you can use it for evil. And allyship is using it for good. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And I think, and Janet, this better than probably anybody on here. DEI right now, has such a stigma attached to it, because people like to think of conversations like privilege about good or bad. They like to think about bias as either good or bad. And I think when we can get to the point of saying it is what it is, it simply exists, let's acknowledge it, and now let's figure out how to use it for good, how to use it to further everyone and to provide equity for others. That to me is when people can sort of, sit back and kind of breathe that sigh of relief and say, oh, maybe this isn't the bad thing that everyone's telling us it is. Maybe it really is just something to acknowledge, discuss, and figure out how to use.
And you made a very good point, with what's going on in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space right now. If you think about this backlash, 2020, for all the wrong reasons, we had a very positive, probably one of the biggest surges in interest in diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. And now here we are, 2024, and it looks like it's going backwards the other way, further back than it was. To tell you, it has not. We are still further ahead now than we were in 2020, but it feels bad. But part of what is making that happen is there are people who feel like they are losing privilege. So they may in a minute say, I don't have privilege, but that's what's causing this. And it is an extreme reaction. And there's a fear of that. And so privilege is real. And people, if you have it, a lot of times you don't know you do. But allyship is accepting that you have it. Because at the end of the day, we wouldn't need allyship if there was not systemic racism. I mean, on all levels, but we're talking about racism today. We wouldn't need allies if systemic racism didn't exist. That's the reason you need them. And so that's the reason it's not a meritocracy, for all those reasons. So I hate that people feel like they can't say they have privilege. I love when people go, I have privilege, and now I'm going to use it. But you can't use it if you don't admit that you have it. And I wish all of us would.
Yes. And I think the more we talk about it in terms of everybody has it in certain situations, hopefully that can help sort of take away some of the stigma that's been attached to it, in my opinion, wrongly. Because I will never say to somebody, you are wrong for being treated well in this situation. Exactly. Because they aren't. That is just something that it exists for a million reasons that we don't have enough podcasts to go through all of them. But again, once you acknowledge it and then start using it, that's when we really see, okay, this isn't good or bad. It simply is. Let's lean into it. But again, as you said, it starts with that acknowledgement, and I think when we can all do that, it really it really opens up the opportunity for everybody to be allies. And I would love to go to the chat and bring up a point from the chat. Bridget mentioned about institutional let's see, sorry, I just lost the comment there. Here we go, institutional privilege. And it started me thinking about some of those systems that exist within institutions that also we need to think about ways of dismantling and ways of acknowledging how that's affecting people. So, and Janet, you talked some about, both interpersonal, institution, and individual. When we think about some of those institutional inequities that have existed, I think that's when we start to realize where some real opportunities lie, where each of us could step up. So some of them are things like thinking about what colleges do organizations recruit from? Are they always going to the Ivy Leagues? And, if so, are you missing out on great candidates? Or even take a step beyond that, requiring a college degree for jobs that may not actually need it. That can be another way where we see some of that institutional, some of those systems that have been in place that truly do need, at minimum, looking at, and quite honestly, oftentimes dismantling. And I think some other things that kind of fall in that category, when we think about compensation, the way organizations and the compensation systems have exist, basing somebody's salary on their past salary.
Because that just keeps the systemic stuff going, right?
Yes.
Exactly. You can never break, you can break the pattern. You just can't.
You can't. And so many organizations do that. But in reality, what I made at my last job has nothing to do with what you expect me to do at this job. Exactly. So let's just quit asking. Let's quit asking. And even promotions, how essential is networking in order to get promotions at a particular organization? Because everybody doesn't have the ability to network in the same way for many different reasons. Right. So I think there's a lot of things that have existed historically that we can really look at and kind of think through.
Agreed.
Yes.
So, go ahead. I'm sorry, I interrupted you again. Go for it, Christy.
No, you're good. You're good.
Nope. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to move us ahead. So if you have anything else, though, on this one, would love to hear any last thoughts.
Nope. No last thoughts. Let's go to the next one.
Perfect. So we want to talk a bit about, what really gets in the way of allyship and what causes some of these situations, both those individual and organizational ones we've talked about. So would love to look a bit at our second lesson. Mitigating bias is learning what's real and unlearning what's rote, which I love that quote in that lesson. So what do you know about bias? How do you use it? What do we know, et cetera? Janet, would love to hear, kind of that tie-in when we think about Juneteenth and how all of that has impacted some of the biases that exist. Would love to hear from you some.
Well, the thing is that Juneteenth ended slavery for some, not all, but the racial bias that fueled and perpetuated it, it remains deeply rooted in society. We know it's there. So, but when we think about racism, sort of like when we talk about privilege, nobody wants to get called a racist. It's a terrible thing. And we think about racism, but that's because we usually envision it as, like conscious bias, systematic bias, explicit bias. But the reality is that you don't often see that in the workplace because, as Christy knows as CHRO, that's an HR call. When that happens, somebody's calling HR. That's not usually what you see. What you see is more subtle than that. And the two kinds that you often see in the workplace are cognitive bias, which is what the NLI talks about in our solutions. And that is nature. I think of that as nature, as in you're born with this, it's evolutionary. It's the things that have allowed you to get to this point because it keeps you out of trouble and you just automatically have some ways to deal with the world. You can make quick decisions with very little information. That's not always bad. It's not always bad, but it kind of means that you're predisposed toward certain people sometimes and certain things for different reasons. And often that is unconscious. That's when we talk about unconscious bias. Every individual has that. If you have a brain, you have bias. So
Mhm.
everybody has that. But then there's another layer and another type of bias that the technical term is implicit bias. But the way I describe it is implicit bias is what happens when you take cognitive bias and drop it into society. And if you're talking about a society that is built on systemic inequity, guess what? And so that is, if cognitive bias is nature, this is nurture. If cognitive bias is predisposed toward, this is prejudiced against. And if cognitive bias is an unconscious thought, implicit bias is being seen more and more often as automatic behaviors. So what's unconscious in that is that you may not be aware of what is triggering your following reaction, the automatic action. Sometimes you are, because that's why you can't really call it unconscious, because sometimes you're absolutely sure you know why you're having this automatic reaction, but you have it, even if you don't sometimes want to have it. And so that's implicit bias, and that's what we see in the workplace more often. The explicit stuff would be easy enough to fix. These two are a little bit harder to deal with. You agree, Christy?
100%, 100%. And, this, when I hear the word bias, again, it reminds me of the same conversation we just had about the word privilege, in that there is so much of a stigma attached to it. And so often people are just rejected. If you say, this may be a bit of bias here, people immediately say, oh, no, not at all. I'm not biased. But we
You
all
are.
are.
You
We
are.
all are. And we have to acknowledge that, because if we don't acknowledge it, then we can't do anything about it.
Exactly.
And so often, again, people kind of have this idea that nope, it's not me, I'm excluded from this. But what I always say is, and instead of thinking about bias as right or wrong, I like to think about it as either narrow or wide. Meaning, am I using a narrow amount of information to make a decision, or am I using a wide amount of information to make a decision? Because when we use a narrow amount, oftentimes that's our bias. We're relying on a past experience, or something reminds us of something else, and we aren't actually judging a situation or a person on its own merit. And that, again, can show up as either that cognitive or that implicit. Sometimes we do it and it isn't quite as unknown as we like to claim that it is. But I think when we start thinking about bias as narrow or wide, the amount of information that we are using to make a decision, then we can really start acknowledging what's happening. And then we can have some of those meaningful conversations that I think we really need to have in order to start changing some things up, if you will.
Well, Christy, I've heard you say before that when you're dealing with implicit bias or the isms, that one solution is always ask yourself why. And I think that's brilliant, because at the end of the day, it's about questioning everything you believe to be true. And whenever I hear people say they about some group, I will say there is no they. There is no they. And I will often tell people, ask yourself this. If you say all Black people, for example, do something, if you truly believe that, ask yourself, do I know anyone that doesn't? Because the minute I know there's one, then I know it's bias and it's prejudice. And prejudice is about stereotyping, which is, deciding that a group of people has certain characteristics based on systemic racism, based on your bias, all that gets combined together. Like I said, bias dropped into society. And whether you want to be or not, you're shaped by the world you're in. If you watch the media is biased. We know this. We know it. We've seen it. And so if you grow up with that, it doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It doesn't mean your parents are bad people. It's systemic. So if you have bias naturally, and then you put it in a place where you can feed that bias or things that feed the wrong narrative, you're going to be biased. So the question is, I like Christy, always ask yourself why. I don't care what it is. Question everything. And it's not just one group that has to do it. Everybody has to do it. And I will tell you, it sounds daunting at first, but after a while, you get used to it. It's natural. It becomes automatic. Just always ask why.
Yes. And I would, to add to that, start with the decisions that you make, but also ask why for larger things, for some of those institution-wide things. Why are we paying people in this way? Why are we promoting this group? Why are we recruiting from these locations? So again, but start with you. And it's something we all need to do. If I have a gut feeling about something, I ask myself, why? Where is this coming from? What is this based on? Because I know I've been influenced by everything in the media, everything around me, the people that I choose to engage with, all of those things, sort of sink in, and I make decisions based on that information that, again, may or may not be accurate, may or may not be based on data. But if before I move forward with a decision, the last thing I always say is, why do I feel this way? Why do I think this is the right course of action? And if I can't back that up and answer with some data that really supports it, then that's a pretty good idea that this is probably some bias at play. And I need to really think through and decide, am I doing this in the best way and for the best reasons?
And one point you made that I want to follow up on, what came up for me was, when you think about it, in general, most of us live very segregated lives.
Yes.
Our neighborhoods are generally of a type. Our schools are often based on where we live, so they are of a type. There's majority, there's some that are very, very diverse, but often far too many of us. And of course, you go to church. If you go to church outside of that, the workplace is the only place for some people where they're ever going to be around anybody who's different than they are. And if they come in with their biases, that's to be expected and understood. But that is an opportunity to challenge those biases. That's an opportunity to find that one person that isn't like all of them. And the minute you see that person, you go, okay, wait a minute, that probably was a bias. And I know that's not easy. That's not easy to do. It's not easy to even admit that you have bias. But at the end of the day, if we truly want to understand the world, we have to learn what's real. Like Christy said, you got to get the data, and we got to unlearn what we believe to be true because it wasn't questioned. And that's what this lesson is about.
I have never thought about what you just said until you just mentioned it, but you were so right. Work is typically the one place where, because we don't have the ability to control who all is there.
Exactly.
And in every other area of our life, we make choices oftentimes based on what feels most comfortable. And,
Right.
We at NLI talk a lot about similarity bias. And I will be the first to admit it feels comfortable. So our neighborhoods, our social activities, people have said, and especially you hear it a lot in the South, Sunday mornings is the most segregated hour ever because our churches still tend to, everybody in there looks alike, and that's what we're comfortable with. So when we take all of that, where we've been running around in our little comfortable, very insular bubbles, and then go into a workplace that is very different, that has a very different makeup, there's no wonder on why sometimes people have that level of discomfort, why they can be hesitant to even acknowledge the bias that they live with, and why we have to have these very real conversations to then move past it or help mitigate against the effects of it. So,
well, you make a good point, because sometimes you don't even know you have the bias until something hits that gut, like you said.
yes.
And the thing is, sometimes we have to recognize that feeling is the right feeling. So if you've had this bias against a group of people and you have to work with somebody, and suddenly what you don't want to do is say, well, they're different. No, they're not different. They're different from what you believe to be true, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily different from the entire group. And so it is very much that way. I mean, I grew up in a small town in North Carolina, and my high school went to public high school, and we were from about 50-50. But I had to get to college to realize that, yes, when we were in the band together, it was 50-50. I mean, you were all there together. That band had to perform. You did that at school. We went to practice together. We went to class together, all those things. I got to college and realized that I did not socialize with any of the white people that I went to school with every day. The people that I traveled all over the country with on buses with the band, the people that I depended on to make sure that we won. I mean, we had a very close and codependent relationship at school. But when I went home, I didn't go to their parties. I didn't go to their neighborhoods. And it took me in college, when I was suddenly living around people that I couldn't get away from, and they couldn't get away from me. I mean, we were in class together, but you're going to see me in the cafeteria, you're going to deal with me, and my issues are going to become your issues. That was the first time that we really came up against the fact that, oh, I had some beliefs about you that maybe I shouldn't have. And it wasn't easy. You want to hold on to those beliefs, but work now as a grown up, work is where that happens. And so I would encourage everybody, to, like Christy said, when you get that feeling in your gut, ask yourself, is this an awareness of the fact that I feel this way? I feel it feels odd because I had a bias and I was looking through a bias lens, and now we're moving that there. And then you go ask why. That you ask why at that point. So,
Yes, absolutely. And, to do something else that Janet mentioned earlier, in really paying attention to when you have that feeling and being okay with that, kind of initial level of discomfort, because so often we run from that.
yeah.
We run from when it doesn't feel comfortable, and we just say, oh, but this is because of them. And it isn't. It's because of us, because quite often of how we've been socialized and who we've been around. And one other point that I want to make or that I want to kind of double down on that Janet made. And so many of us are quick to say always and never. This group always does this and this group never does that. And people like this always think this way. If you can think of that one exception, hold on to that. And Janet, I don't know if you've ever had this experience. I know I have, where people have said directly to me, oh, I don't mean you.
Yes, you're different.
Yes, you're not like the rest of them. And I say,
Exactly.
and the follow-up is always, so if I'm not, do you really think I am that much of a unicorn? Or do you think maybe your definition of this group isn't as accurate as you thought it was?
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
it's so interesting. Every time you hear that, oh, no, not you. I don't mean you. I'm not talking about your people. I'm talking about the rest of them. Like, well, no.
And the thing is, that's my point about sometimes, even when it's a good feeling, you need to question it. Because
Yes.
if you see somebody and go, oh, they're different, that's the point at which you question. I mean, because then that's a positive thing. And you probably, if this happens, you probably think you're giving somebody a compliment, and you are, but you're complimenting them for the wrong reasons. So I'm saying, even when that happens, and be open to that, look for those things. That is still bias. It's still bias, and it's still an opportunity to mitigate it.
Absolutely. And as Bridget just pointed out in the chat, positive stereotyping has negative consequences, and it absolutely does. Just because we automatically assume one group is great at something, that still means we're not considering other people for those opportunities. So there's still some negative consequences. Maybe not to the person that you've attributed or assigned that positive assumption, but to others. So it's still, regardless of if it has a positive or negative sort of tone to it, it still can be problematic. And I love, if you didn't see in the chat, Tony just dropped the link to the case for stepping outside your comfort zone. And I think that is such an important sort of thing to think about and to do as frequently as you can. It isn't easy, but it is so incredibly necessary. And I think, the folks that it's really necessary for, some of those people who still don't believe that they're biased, or they don't care that they are. And maybe starting with stepping outside that comfort zone can be one of the ways. But would love to talk some about, how do we deal with those? How do we deal with the people who are quick to say, I'm not biased, it's not me, this doesn't affect me at all. Or maybe they know it and they just don't care. And I think that really brings us to our third lesson, where equity isn't fair people, equity is fair systems. And I think that is such an important thing for us to keep in mind. And especially with Juneteenth, it's a reminder that being fair isn't always about treating everybody the same. It's about fixing what's broken. And I have said many times, there is nothing more unfair than the equal treatment of unequal people. And I'm going to say that one more time. There is nothing more unfair than the equal treatment of unequal people. So just a quick example, many of you may have seen there's a picture online that goes around where you see three people standing trying to see over a fence. And one of them is already tall enough to see over the fence. One of them is, the top of the fence is coming like to the top of their head. And the other one is about 2 feet or so below the fence. Now, if we were to give each of those individuals one box to stand on, that would be equal. Everybody got the same thing. But the person who's already tall enough to see over the fence didn't need it. And the person who's, really short probably needs 2 boxes. So in our whole thought around, we just need to make systems equal, then we're still missing the opportunity to provide for that equity, providing for what people actually need. So that's where fair systems really come into play. We can't just magically change history. Unfortunately, I don't think any of us have that magic wand. So we can't magically change things that have led to some of the assumptions that we make about others, but we can create some equitable systems that help to even out that playing field. We can give, in that scenario, the shortest person 2 boxes to stand on so they can see over the fence when that taller person didn't need any. And I think those are the kind of systems we want to talk about. Janet, what are your thoughts there?
Well, I think this message, this lesson, and this thought is very, very, very important now. When it looks like things, the needle's going backwards. I'd welcome everybody to think about it. So when the enslaved in Galveston were freed, does anybody think that at that point they're like, okay, we're free now, let's go do what we want to do? No. They'd been deprived of education, all these kind of things. They did not start at the same spot. Okay. So that's the issue with equity. We don't all start at the same place. And some of us, in this country at least, because of systemic racism, there are whole groups of us who started back in the other way. Some of us have broken through. Some of us have done well, some do really, really well. But in general, there are huge wage gaps. I think I read the other day that for every Black family earns 15 cents average for every dollar that a white family earns. That is not somebody's moral failing. That's a systemic problem. And truly, we need to understand that when we talk, that means you can't solve it individually. That's not something that individuals, being good actors and can we all just get along, that doesn't solve it. It's a systemic issue. It's much bigger. And the reason I think it's really interesting now is if you think about recently, I read that there is something going on in the Senate, the House, whatever. Somebody's put a bill out that they want to take DEI out of the federal government. And that doesn't surprise me. But if you think about what they said, the way they framed it was, we want to get back to equality and meritocracy and get away from equity. Believe what they say the first time, because they said it. I mean, because they recognize that equity is the thing that's needed. And equity is the hardest thing to get. Equity didn't even come into the DEI phraseology until about the 2010s. It got really big in 2020 with when people saw, police inequity on their screens. But it used to be just D&I, diversity and inclusion. And then we started with equity. But equity is the hardest one to achieve. And the reason is this: in an inequitable world, equity itself is disruption. And we don't like disruption. And so if you think about how it operates in an organization, it operates on all those 3 levels too. The individual level, you want to individual interpersonal level, you want to provide equity when you can. You want to be equitable as much as you can be. But I know a lot of people think, well, I don't solve systemic problems. I don't hire, I don't fire, I don't do anything. That's above my pay grade. But the bottom line is that's where it has to get done. So is there anything that you could do? And Christy, I know you've talked many times about sort of the systemic inequities and where they live. I mean, you've done this work before. Is there, I'll think a little bit about what people can do. Have you ever seen where individuals were ever able to change any of this stuff from a systemic level?
I think where individuals really play a role is starting with the awareness, starting with the conversations, starting with starting with questioning things. So often we all get very comfortable with, this is how it's always been done. We've always structured compensation in this way. We've always structured our hiring process in this way. And what individuals can do is, it's almost like play dumb just for a moment and just say, well, why?
But why?
It only takes one person questioning something to get a conversation started, because so often that why is rooted in something that is very inequitable. And so that's the first thing I think individuals can do, is simply ask a question, lead with curiosity. Don't just accept this is how it's always been done, because maybe it worked 20, 30, 40 years ago, but there are very few things that haven't evolved since then, except for so many policies. So many things have just We put them on the books and we leave them there and we keep riding with that. That's the practice that we've adopted. So I think that's one of the first things people can do. Always ask why, lead with that curiosity. And then I think another thing is just acknowledge when we look around, and we will see sometimes, I've seen situations where, the way they responded to this person in this meeting just didn't make sense, or the way they're structuring this policy just doesn't make sense. And when I see those things, just taking it upon myself to speak up, having the courage, having the desire to be an ally, whatever word you want to use, but speaking up and identifying those inequities. Because again, and you mentioned it, oftentimes the people who have privilege, people who have the advantage, I saw someone in the chat said, we often use the words advantage instead of privilege, which has the exact same concept. People who have that don't recognize they have it because that's just their norm.
Right.
And when something is your norm, you don't always see that you just assume that exists for everybody. So when we do get to that point of identifying, lean into it, bring it up, talk about it, because chances are maybe the person doesn't even recognize this is problematic. So, as individuals, we can question things and we can talk about things when we notice it, and try and push back on some of those policies and think creative, get innovative, make suggestions that can potentially change situations, bring other people into your conversations and onto your teams whose perspectives haven't been listened to before. So, we all, regardless of our role in organizations, we all have the ability to act as a leader in a moment. So regardless of your title, take that opportunity to act as the leader and ask those very strategic questions that I think we need to lean into a bit.
Absolutely. It's about, you can influence policy even if you can't actually change the system. You never know when the suggestion you make or the question you raise, it goes up the ladder and maybe it changes. And so I definitely agree that that's what we all can do that. And a couple of other things we can do is you can leverage your role. Okay, so maybe you aren't in HR. If you are, that's kind of a clear way to do it. But suppose you're in marketing. I mean, I came out of the marketing world and I was always the one who would say, these photos are not inclusive. You leverage your role wherever you are. You use what you can to find inequity and root it out and push back against it. And that's good, because even if you're changing systems, there's some systems nobody's going to change, or there's some systems you don't think about. That's going to come from the ground up. That's going to come from people doing this work day in and day out and calling out where it exists. So my father used to say, always have your head on swivel, always have your head on swivel, looking for where the problems are. The other thing we can do is one thing that we do already is sort of amplify, collaborate, get collective strength. We all have these ERGs and BRGs within our organizations. That's a real good opportunity for a group of folks to advocate, not only for themselves, but for others. Because a lot of times people think if you say something individually, well, that's just you. But if an entire group of people come and say something, somebody's got to listen. So
Yes.
It is about saying, you said earlier, like leverage your advantage. If you're in an ERG, for example, and that's an advantaged group, leverage it for somebody else. You're advocating for yourself, advocate for others too. That's what allyship is like. And collectively, we can all do so much more than we do individually.
Absolutely. There is strength in numbers. And I can think back to when I was in HR leadership roles where, just as you said, if one person came and complained about something or brought something to my attention, it's real easy sometimes to ignore one person, even if it's a small thing that isn't about equity. One person comes and says the office is too hot. Okay, that's just them. Now, if 20 people come and say it, I'm going to listen. I'm like, oh, let me talk to our maintenance people. Let me figure out what we need to do. And the same thing applies to all of the systems within our organization. So talk to other people. When this is a great opportunity to really leverage those groups that already exist, or more importantly, to leverage those conversations that we are already having. Because I think most of us already talk to colleagues in our workplaces that we know have some similarities, that we know have noticed some common things that we've noticed as well. We're having the conversation. This is just about taking the additional step of now bringing it to other people's attention, but doing so as a group. And the upside of that is when you do it as a group, it takes a little bit of that risk away from you.
Absolutely.
sometimes there may be hesitancy to raise your hand. You don't want to be the person who says, well, this isn't fair. This might be a problem. But when you do it as a part of a group, you don't feel like you're standing alone. So it's not as difficult. It's not as scary of a conversation. There can be you feel a bit more safe, if you will, in kind of engaging in those conversations. So utilize the groups that are already out there and existing.
Well, now, Christy, I know you are great at looking in the chat, and we know that I am terrible about looking in the chat. So before we get to the point where we're wrapping up here a little bit, are there any questions in the chat that you've seen or any comments that we should address or can address at this point? Because we want to bring this conversation.
It's so funny. As you were saying that, I was literally opening the chat and reading
See?
through things. So you are right. That is where I go to see what else is going on. We haven't had any questions yet, but I do encourage people, if you have questions, now's a great time to throw them in. However, we have had a lot of affirmations and sort of agreeing to a lot of the things we said. And one comment I'd love to read. Thank you for affirming the nuance and difference. It also seems to let people feel more comfortable rather than grow through their discomfort to learn and raise their awareness. Thanks again. And
Absolutely.
I think that phrase of growing through our discomfort, I love that. Donna, thank you for phrasing it that way, because ultimately that's what we all need to do. They're going, this conversation, thinking about equity, thinking about bias, thinking about kind of raising your hand when we notice things can feel very uncomfortable, but it is an opportunity for us to grow through that. And that, I think, is what, ideally I would love to say we are each charged to do. And when we all focus on that, that's when we can see some of these systemic problems. That's when we can start acknowledging the systemic racism that's affecting so many things. So that's when we then have that bigger opportunity to change it.
Because you think about it, the only way you know that something is wrong is if it hurts. It's discomfort. When you get sick, there's discomfort. So you know you need to go fix it. And we live in a world and a society where there are a lot of things that are just going to make you uncomfortable. And but that is how we change it. That's how you know that it's a problem. So I love that too. Grow through your discomfort. I mean, because if you go through the discomfort, you will grow as a result of having done it. So I love that term too. I'm using that. Thanks, Donna.
Me too. Yes. So am I. I'm going to use it because it is so important, so important. And let's see, we do have a question. What have you all seen to be the most effective accountability practices to ensure the execution of new behaviors and systems? And what change management practices have you seen as most effective? Melissa, that's a really big question that could probably take us through a whole nother session. And Tony, if you have the ability, I'm going to put you on the spot here. We've just put out some pieces on accountability. So, and Janet, I know you have some thoughts on kind of that intersection of accountability and DEI. If I remember correctly, I think you just published something, or maybe you're in process of putting something together for that. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's one in the works for that. I absolutely, think that accountability is really, the lack of it, I think, is one of the biggest hindrances to diversity, equity, inclusion getting into organizations. Because if you don't have to do it, why would you? And not just accountability, but getting some sort of I won't say reward, but not just accountability, but incentive. Because there's two ways to get people to do stuff, right? Carrot, stick. And carrot is much better. But the way we think about it in LI, the way you do that in a way that is less confrontational is you make diversity, equity, inclusion part of the business plan. You put it into the business. Because at the end of the day, you can't change people's minds. You can't change their beliefs, but you can change their behavior. Because as an organization, you can decide this is what we stand for. This is who we are. This is what inclusion looks like here. And then be as concrete about it as possible. Because if it's concrete, if it's objective, then you can go backfill, you can, re-engineer the systems you need to support it. But at the end of the day, it takes accountability. You want people to do things for the right thing, for the right reason, but that assumes that everybody thinks it's the right reason. And that's why we talk about systems, because if you really want to infuse an organization and make it a place where people feel included and there's an inclusive society in that organization, it has to be part of the systems, because it can't depend on the person who cares being in that seat. It can't depend on one person. It can't depend on one team. It cannot depend on people as individuals. You have to bake it in. And accountability is the way you bake it in. Make people accountable for something. And if you want to make them accountable for something, make them accountable for the business and make sure that whatever they're accountable for the business, there's diversity tied to it. And then you know what? They'll be accountable for diversity too. But just giving people stray targets without any accountability and not any really good reason for it. We want to increase the number of Black people in senior leadership by 30%, but you don't know why. You haven't accepted why that's a good thing. You haven't got any accountability to do it. It's not that you don't want to, but you're going to do the things you're accountable for. At the end of the day, we do what we're accountable for. And so accountability is huge. And in the DEI space, it is about not just leaders need to be accountable, but it needs to filter down, because we talked about that collective strength. When everybody is engaged and being accountable for diversity, equity, and inclusion, that's how it happens. And the one thing that everybody in that organization is there to do is to make that business work right. So tie it
Yes,
together and you get the collective strength.
absolutely. I've often said, if you ask somebody whose job is it to be fiscally responsible in an organization, they're going to say everybody. Even you don't have to be a member of the finance department or accounting team or anything like that. Everyone understands it is their job to make decisions that are fiscally responsible.
Absolutely.
But if you were to ask whose job is it to prioritize DEI, they're going to say, oh, our diversity department or our HR department. And we need to take that same approach. We need to have it so ingrained into the culture of the company that everyone acknowledges this is my responsibility. We are all doing this together. And that's when we can see and really have that impact. Someone asked a question about collaborating and with ERGs. And that's one of the ways we can do that when we hold everyone accountable, when we say to everyone, this is all of our responsibility, it really starts to make it a part of who you are as an organization. And I think that's, one of the goals we have to have.
And accountability is key, because a lot of times we say that and we don't tell people how they can do it. You should all be accountable for this, but I don't give you any way to do it, which is why, like I said, I've come to the conclusion over the years that is why you tie it to business outcomes, because that's always going to be there. That's always going to be there. And at the end of the day, in the workplace, diversity is valued because of what it contributes to the business. If you ask organizations, they'll say, well, we want to have, we want diversity because of innovation. Okay. How are you going to leverage it if it's not embedded in the organization? Some will say, we just want an inclusive culture. Okay. But even when you have an inclusive culture, why do you have it? Because you want to be able to better work together. You want to be better able to deliver on something. I mean, I do think there are a lot of organizations where you have leaders who want to create sort of a certain environment. But at the end of the day, especially if it's I don't want to say nonprofits, because nonprofits have a mission too. It's a slightly different mission, but they too have a mission. And whatever it is, you want an inclusive culture, not just because it's a good thing to have, but because it helps you achieve whatever your vision is. And if you tie diversity, equity, inclusion to that and just don't leave it out in the air, it gets done.
Absolutely. Well, we have gone through a lot. And really linked Juneteenth to these critical leadership lessons. So just to kind of recap our takeaways, when we think about what it means to be an ally, it's speaking up for others, not just about them. So speak up for them, not just about them. And what do we know about bias? We need to challenge our own perspectives. And when we think about how to address inequity, advocate for fair systems, not just fair treatment. And I will say not just equal treatment. So Janet, any closing thoughts?
Only one. If you are interested in keeping up with what the DEI Center of Practice is doing, Center of Excellence at NLI is doing, Christy and I write all the time. If you will put practice update in the chat, you'll get an email, if you want to get an email, that will have a list of the latest DEI publications, podcasts, papers, anything to keep you up to date. So just put practice update in the chat and we'll take care of it. And now I'll hand it back to Shelby. Thank you, Christy.
Yes, thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, ladies, so much. That was such a powerful conversation. Now, a few more closing announcements. So we have our poll. Let us know how NLI can help you and how you may want to work with us. Summit 2024 is underway. This year, we're going fully virtual, and it will take place on October 29th and 30th. We have our official event website live now with tickets, information on topics and speakers, and more. So visit summit.neuroleadership.com for all your needs. We also have an early bird special, so you make sure that you want to hop on that. And if you're listening to the podcast, you can use the discount code YourBrainAtWork24 and get 10% off. Insider Exchange, this is specifically for senior executives. If you're interested and enjoy Your Brain at Work Live, we think you'll love this program. It's an exclusive opportunity to have conversations with our internal leaders. So if that's something that interests you, we'll share the link in the chat. Also, hosting events with us, we really want to expand and partner with our community. So if you're interested in your organization hosting an event with us, check out that link as well to learn more information. And our podcast, Your Brain at Work, wherever you listen to your podcast, this episode and many other great ones are on there. So make sure that you check it out. And this is where we say farewell. So on behalf of our team behind the scenes, thank you so much for being here each week. We appreciate you, and we'll see you again next Friday. Have a wonderful day.